Psalms 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Almost as though whoever arranged the Psalter was going to say, hold that vision from those first two Psalms in your head, because for much of the time you're going to be praying and living your way through Psalm 3, which I'm going to look at in more detail, Psalm 4, which is about people who are finding that they're being disturbed internally and externally in various ways and being scorned and so on. Psalm 5, somebody who is saying, listen to the sound of my cry, I'm in bad shape, I just need to cling on to you. Psalm 6, Lord, don't rebuke me in your anger or discipline me in your wrath. And Psalm 7, oh Lord, I'm needing to come and take refuge in you because people are after me. And one way and another, those sum up so much of the problems that the Psalms lay before God. And indeed, Psalm 3 is the first point in the Psalter where the whole psalm is a prayer to God rather than a statement about God, God's people, the world, the Messiah, etc. Because the Psalms do it in different ways, just like the average hymn book contains some hymns which are direct addresses to God and some hymns which are about ourselves as worshippers or which are about other people or the world or whatever. I remember my mother in her last illness when she was struggling to say her prayers as she always had done. And I said, well, Mum, you know the Psalms, you can pray the Psalms, you've prayed them all your life. And she said, to my astonishment, she said, yes, but David always had trouble with his pronouns. And I said, this is a 90-something-year-old woman. I said, Mum, what on earth are you talking about? And she said, well, sometimes he says he, and sometimes he says you, sometimes he says I. He can't make up his mind whether he's talking to God or about himself. And I said, well, Mum, isn't that how prayer often is? You're musing about how life is, and sometimes that turns into direct address to God, and then other times it sort of wanders off into thinking about the world, and then you come back to God, and sometimes you may hear God saying you to you. I don't know whether that helped my mum. We had a bit of a laugh about it. David having trouble with his pronouns indeed. But here in Psalm 3, we find a direct address. Oh Lord, how many are my foes? And it's about enemies. And there are lots of enemies in the Psalms. Sometimes it's almost as though the psalmist seems obsessed with the fact that people are out to get him. And the heading of this psalm, the headings were almost certainly added sometime later after the Psalms were written. But the heading which we have here is a psalm of David when he fled from his son Absalom. Halfway through the second book of Samuel, we find that tragic episode where after David's adultery with Bathsheba, things go horribly wrong among David's sons and daughters, and Absalom rises up in rebellion, and David finds he has to run away. And it's quite an appropriate psalm for a moment like that, when suddenly it seems as though lots of people who David thought he could rely on are now ganging up against him. He's still got faithful followers. They go off with him into a kind of mini version of the exile. But, oh Lord, how many are my enemies? There are many who are rising up against me. And particularly verse 2, the enemies are saying, God's not going to help you this time. There is no help for you in God. And as I read this and as I pray this, I have a sense that this is a reflection of voices which we hear inside our own heads, as well as things that other people will say to us. Sometimes tragically, even in church life, people will say scornfully and bitterly, oh, well, God's not going to get you out of this one. But sometimes we say that to ourselves, that we know that God has helped us in the past, but we find ourselves in a mess, and it may be of our own making, as in a sense David's mess with Absalom was long range of his own making. But then the voices in our own heads say, well, that's it then. You've brought it upon yourself. Don't think you can expect God to get you out of it. And faced with that kind of situation, enemies without and within, the answer is in verse 3, to reach out and cling on to who God actually is and who he has been and who he has promised to be in relation to us ourselves. Lord, you are about me as a shield, a military implement which will keep these darts away, a defense against everything that the enemy can do. You are about me as a shield, and also my glory. That's a fascinating idea. God is the one who actually is interested in us gaining and preserving our self-respect, our sense of dignity, our awareness of our own worth to God and perhaps to his world. You are about me like a shield, my glory, and the one who lifts up my head.